Yeah, cool. Okay, the program co-hosted by myself, Andre Lopez Turner, in association with Juan Toledo, in also association with ztrradio.podomatic.com and Artefacto, welcomes Robert Sutherland Smith, the chairman of the United Swimmers Association of Hampstead Heath, into the Zoom chat studio this evening to discuss the encroaching privatisation of the Hampstead Heath ponds by the City of London Corporation, to discuss the Hampstead Heath Act of 1871, and the wider issue of public access to our public spaces here in London and around the world, actually. So welcome, Robert. Very nice to have you here. Thank you very much
Good evening.
for coming in. Yeah,
hello.
welcome, Juan. Thank you.
Hello. No. Yes.
The editor of Revista Perro Negro as well. So lovely to have you here, co-host. So Robert, where are we at the moment in terms of the Hampstead Heath ponds, the men's pond, the women's pond, the mixed pond, the Lido?
Okay, well, I wish I could say this was a simple matter. It's not. It's a story which has got a great deal in it: philosophy, sharp practice, ethics, lack of ethics. There's even the villain in the form of the old squire of Hampstead. But essentially, so it's a bit complex, and to understand it, you've got to have a bit of history. But very simply, if you take yourself back to the 1860s, London was growing enormously, and what is now Hampstead was then part of the old county of Middlesex, and it seemed that very soon that would be swallowed up in, by building. And there was an attempt, actually, by the then local squire, the wicked squire, who wanted to develop the whole site for housing. And he was essentially stopped in doing that by a group of people led by a Quaker banker called John Gurney Hall, a very affluent and influential individual. And he led the campaign to save the Heath. Now, what happened was that the squire was actually bought out. He realized he wasn't going to get away with building these great housing estates that he had in mind. And in order to acquire the land, there was a crowdfunding operation in which people right across London put money together in order to buy the Heath for the use of the people. And as part of this operation, an Act of Parliament was passed called the 1871 Hampstead Heath Act, and that declared quite clearly, without any doubt whatsoever, that the Heath had been acquired for the free use of the people of London, and indeed all the people of Britain. And so that's the way it's been run ever since. Now, it's worth pointing out that the City of London Corporation have only been running the Heath since about 1996, I think I'm right in saying. For the vast majority of the time, Hampstead Heath was run by mainly the London County Council, which was the broadly based local government body, and before that, the Metropolitan Board of Works. So the Corporation of London came onto the scene fairly late, and they came on as a result of a political manoeuvre in which then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who couldn't abide seeing County Hall opposite on the other side of the River Thames because it was socialist, decided to do away with it. And so that meant finding somebody to operate the Hampstead Heath. And so the City of London seemed the obvious people, partly because they run other green spaces, and partly because they had tons of money. And so they were chosen to do that particular job. And when they took it on, they knew perfectly well what they were doing. They knew perfectly well they were taking on an obligation, which meant that Hampstead Heath should be kept free. And access to it should not be enclosed, and there should be no charges. So part of the criticism, or accusation, if you like, against the Corporation of London is that they have dismally and abysmally failed to honour that undertaking that they gave at that time. Right. And they were given, we understand, and this requires a bit more research, but it was said at the time they were given certain tax incentives to do this. And if they did, they've still got them. And look as though they might well have conveniently forgotten about those. But now, of course, they think they found a way to charge, and they've done that with a piece of what I call sharp practice. There's another piece of legislation which came in. Sorry, this is very complicated, I know.
No.
I hope I'm making it
No.
clear.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Excellent.
but there's another piece of legislation which was more general, and it said that local authorities could charge for swimming facilities. So the Corporation of London decided they could get round the Hampstead Heath Act of 1871 by using this bit of legislation. The two things are incompatible so far as Hampstead Heath is concerned. And in doing that, it seems to me that the Corporation of London behaved in an unethical way. They should not have attempted to use that legislation to introduce charges on the duck ponds, as somebody has described them recently, of Hampstead Heath, where people have been free swimming for nothing with the fish and the ducks for many years. So the whole thing, to my mind, is a bit scandalous. I don't think it's something they should have done. I don't think in doing that, I don't think they've enhanced their reputation. Quite the reverse. So there we are. Without going on too long, that is, I hope.
Can I chip in at the moment? Just to pick on the bigger picture and also on the historical sort of background that you had just given, Robert. You were talking about the Greater London Authority when Ken Livingstone was on the other side of the river, the Thames River. And as you are absolutely right, Margaret Thatcher decided to kind of disband the Great London Authority and create these little councils, which in certain ways was the sort of kind of is the centralization of government kind of creeping into local authorities, and that has been happening since then. And
Yeah.
one of the problems that you have, I mean, I can perfectly understand the argument, but in the greater context is this: not that the City of London Corporation is short of money. It must be the only local authority, one of the very few local authorities we know not being short of money. For example, today there was the news that apparently Croydon Council here in South London is going to get rid of about, I don't know, 300 people, 400 people, whatever it is. But the idea is this: local government takes funds away from local authorities, and local authorities then are forced to generate their own income. How do they generate their own income? Things like parking, fines, etc., etc. I would imagine that, for example, when you talk about the streaming, if you think about that, would be streaming in an open natural space, which is very different from streaming in a kind of leisure center. So I presume the legislation becomes very, very flimsy there. And of course, I mean, the City of London Corporation doesn't need to charge for people to stream freely in the ponds in Hampstead. But what happened is, what I'm trying to say is this: they use a sort of kind of historical and political legacy to try to get away with these kind of things. But the problems that come from the past, and you mentioned rightly so, 1986, when Margaret Thatcher decided to disband the Greater London Authority.
Yes, I mean, nobody before has ever done this. Nobody's ever thought of doing this.
Yeah.
All the other managers of the Heath, the London County Council.
When I was doing the research on the City of London Corporation today, there was a stark quote that said local government legislation often makes special provision for the city to be treated as a London borough and for the Common Council to act as local authority, the Common Council being the Common Council of the City of London Corporation.
Yeah.
But the City of London Corporation its mission statement is to look after the financial interests of the square mile. It's effectively the square mile of the City of London. So it gets this special authorities in quite a lot of places, 150 different green spaces actually, to do something that effectively it shouldn't have any jurisdiction over, because it is to look after the financial interest.
But they have two responsibilities. One, which I suppose you can call the statutory responsibility of the local government, look after the roads, the police force, all that sort of stuff.
Mm.
And then you've got the things they look after as a charity, and they use charitable funds for that. They look after the green spaces, certain green spaces in London. Epping Forest is one.
Mm.
Okay.
And so that's the distinction.
So it's
One is financed
okay.
from charity.
Fine. Okay. So
One
okay.
is financed from charitable funds. And the things that actually happen in the City of London are financed from local rates, local taxes, as I understand it.
Yeah.
Before we diverge off here, but can we just go, the current day situation is they have opened the ponds after a lockdown, and they are now charging people £4 a swim. People can only go 3 times a week and they have to book. There is a concessionary charge of £2.50, I think, or £2.40 for seniors, the unemployed. This is what they're currently doing. And prior to COVID, there was a consultation period late last year or early this year that we both went to, where they operated so-called in a consulting fashion and in good faith, because they really did want to have mandatory charging for the ponds. And previous to this, as I understand, Robert, you know these things, there was a voluntary donation, wasn't there, that preceded this? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean,
yeah.
there was a period of consultation, but I certainly complained at the time.
It was very
that
rough.
it wasn't in accordance with the best practice that is laid down for local authorities and this sort of thing. So I think they breached that. They rushed it. They weren't really listening, and they maintain something called the Consultative Committee of Hampstead Heath, which is made up of local representatives who advise them as to the advisability and desirability of certain things. The swimmers came up with an idea which they had been pressing on the City of London for some time without any obvious response from the City of London, that perhaps contributions could be made in excess of the cost of swimming by those swimmers who could afford it, to make sure that people who couldn't afford to pay money to swim in the ponds continue to do so. And the Consultative Committee decided that this was worth trying. They said this is, worth a try. But the City of London Corporation ignored that, and which strikes me as pretty extraordinary, that they should have a committee with whom they consult, but they just simply ignore. So many drew the conclusion that they weren't really listening. It wasn't a real consultation. The decision really was made somewhere in the darker recesses of the Corporation of London in EC2 somewhere. And so the whole process, in my opinion, was flawed. Have I answered the question, or is there more to come?
No, yeah. I wanted to ask you another question, Robert. I mean, every charity has a particular status, and they are regulated by the Charity Commission. I presume if they started to charge for this kind of thing, I don't know if anything in the charities charter which prevent them from doing what they are doing right now. Because what you said, these people own certain green spaces in London, like the Epping Forest and Hampstead Heath.
They may own the Epping Forest. They
don't own it. They run it. They don't own it. They run it.
They may own that, but I don't believe that they really own Hampstead Heath. They manage Hampstead Heath.
Yeah, they have managed. Okay.
They are they have certain legal responsibilities as the managers and occupiers of the Heath. But I think the ownership really goes back to the time when the crowdfunding took place and funds were raised across London to buy the Heath for the people.
Yeah.
It is a complex matter, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Not easy to understand.
Yeah, well, it is, but it was for the people, to be used by the people, free of charge. And it seems like,
and that was very clear.
And the City of London Corporation has taken the Heath over and is effectively privatizing these swimming ponds. That's what they're doing. And the argument will be possibly that local body councils can't afford to maintain or run the Heath. I can see that as an argument, but then we talk about them being a corporation. And a corporation is a private entity there to make money, as I understand as a definition. Then we talk about them being a charity. So it's like an oxymoron here. What are you? Then we talk about them having 100 people on a common council with 25 aldermen and a Lord Mayor and 2 sheriffs. And everyone who's on the common council is a Freemason and connected to business.
Well, I don't know whether they're Freemasons.
Well,
if you ask them, they're supposed to tell you, but I've never asked them, so I don't know.
I know,
but certainly the tradition is that the City of London does have what they would regard, no doubt, as a proud association with Freemasonry.
Yeah.
Whether how important that is in relation to this matter, I'm not sure. But,
well, I think what I'm trying to make the point is that this is a corporation who says they're doing charitable work, who sits above the Greater London Authority and local body authorities. So that's the point I'm making. And the only people that can actually vote for these 100 Common Council men are the residents of the square mile, which there aren't many of, and the business.
About 5,000, I believe.
Yeah, there used to be 130,000 prior to the Second World War. And my point being is, and the businesses also get to vote. So if we
they have most of the votes.
They have most of the votes. I think there's 100 businesses associated with the City of London Corporation here. And each business gets more votes depending on the size of their staff and their workforce. So I guess my point, Robert, here is, and Juan and anyone else's, are they legitimate in the sense of what they're doing? Obviously they are, because they're doing it, but now they're turning around and they're extremely wealthy. We know their cash fund is rumored to be 2.5 billion. I've got the figures here, and another fund of 1.3 billion. But then I will add another more controversial topic to this. We were saying Joseph Stiglitz calls them the unofficial tax haven in the City of London and England, backed up by a guy called Nicholas Shaxson, who's written about a book on tax havens. So if it's not them that's acting this way, but the banks and the financial interests around this, we could be talking with a lot more money. So the argument that they don't have enough money seems also very spurious. Yeah. That's where I'm coming from. And in regards to the 1871 Hampstead Heath Act, which says it should be free of use for the public. And this is not happening. So I know it's a complicated matter. I've thrown quite a lot in there.
It's a complicated business.
There are many people who sit on this side, various associations.
Well, there are a lot of questions that previously people haven't asked. It was only when they decided that they wanted to start charging the Hampstead Heath that people started to ask certain questions. And I mean, one of the questions is, for example, the charitable funds, which make them a very powerful and influential body. That's where their influence really comes from, the existence of these charitable funds, appear to be controlled by a very small number of people. I've read an account which said a couple of aldermen virtually control that thing. Now, there is, it seems to me, a legitimate line of argument that says, well, surely if these funds are held for the benefit of London, there should be a group of trustees who more widely represent the interests of the people of London, who might question why it is, that the judicial affairs of the Central Criminal Court are paid for not out of City of London taxes, but out of charitable funds. Those strike me as very, that strikes me as very anomalous. It doesn't seem to me appropriate. In other words, I'm saying that it's also curious, of course, that you have in London you have two London governments. You've got the
Yeah,
City of
the
London.
city of. I was going to ask you that. I mean, it is obviously private money getting into the public realm, isn't it? That's what it is, and it's quite interesting when you're talking about, for example, the Court of Justice. If they are wrong with this,
Yes, we're talking about one particular. We're talking about one particular court. It's a central criminal court, the Old Bailey.
the Old Bailey. Well, it's the Palace of Justice, isn't it? It's the one on Fleet Street, and if
Yes,
it's
it
wrong,
is.
yeah, and if, but one of the most important courts
Yeah,
in the country, legal courts in the country, and if it's run with charitable money, with charitable money that comes from the City of London Corporation, there is an element of privatization of how it is run. In the same way that we're discussing about the ponds, or the
yes,
same way that we might discuss it about Epping Forest, what they might do with Epping Forest.
yes,
And then on the other side, and that's the thing, it's kind of almost like a feudal system, because they got the money, they got this independence, and they are able to do things to extend beyond their own sort of kind of physical territory, because
yes,
these places is not within their own jurisdiction, as Andrew was saying
yes.
before.
Well,
And
these
then you got,
again.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm interrupting.
no, no,
Apologise.
no. On the other side, you got Sadiq Khan, who is the mayor of London, who has been talking about creating a citizens' charter. The a citizen charter could be part of this. The idea of the citizens of London to be able to enjoy the free spaces of London and maintain them within the public domain, not to privatize, particularly the public spaces. I'm talking about green spaces, parks and stuff. Because if you think about it, a city like London, many, many places are privatized, many places. We wonder about, for example, these fantastic buildings, that hopefully now with the crisis, we're going to stop seeing more and more skyscrapers changing the landscape of London. That's seriously a manifestation of money. They are private places. There are places where you don't have, the public doesn't have access. You know, Public places, Royal Festival Hall, public places, even the British Library, places like that. So there is an argument, a strong argument about keeping private money from certain elements of city life, including ponds and including courts of justice and other examples, I'm sure. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
yes.
Yes.
Well, I think there has to be a proper understanding
Yeah.
as to what is the appropriate um, use of such funds.
Yeah.
I don't think that question has ever been asked up until now, probably. Maybe it has been, but I don't know. But certainly it's now a matter of great interest because of what's happened to the ponds,
Exactly.
because that opens the door to all sorts of
Also,
situations.
it creates precedents, dangerous
Yeah,
precedents. Yeah,
yes,
indeed.
indeed.
In respect to the Old Bailey, they are involved in the Old Bailey.
Yeah.
They're called the High Officers and Other Officials is what they call them, and they are deeply involved in that. They also run 30 committees associated with almost everything, actually. And they have their own separate police force as well. So the
Yeah.
Metropolitan Police is not the City of London Corporation's
No.
police. They have their own police.
I mean, all of this runs contrary to what is familiar economics. I mean, normally smaller organizations get taken over by bigger organizations for economies of scale. So that's another aspect of all this. Why is it that the city corporation, still exists in such a world?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it was founded in 1191. There's a whole lot here, but it is a very bizarre, some of the questions we've asked and what we're talking about. But if we just get back to these ponds where people have swam in them free for hundreds of years, there's a sense of community around them. There's a sense of belonging. There's a sense of wonder at nature. They've always been frequented by a great diverse bunch of people from London, Great Britain, and the world. And the health benefits of cold water immersion and swimming in terms of the immune system, etc., is enormous. And now we're in a predicament where there is a concern that this regime of 3 swims a week, £4 a swim, that's £48 a month, may continue. And this is very concerning. There's countless letters to the associations, the Hampstead Men's Pond Association, the Kenwood Ladies Pond Association, United Swimmers Association. And the two people that sit on the committee is Anne Fairweather and Bob Warnock. And not to mention all the letters to the editor at the Camden New Journal, the Ham and High, where Robert gives great letters to. Yours truly's done a few. And it got to the point, just to fill you in, Juan, where none of these were responded to, really. And then Keir Starmer got in on the act and wrote a wonderful letter asking many probing questions, to which then...
About specifically the ponds?
About exactly what we're talking about
okay,
here.
Excellent. And has he got any replies?
I'm not sure. I mean, quite a few of us have thanked him for doing it.
Yeah.
But what did happen, curiously, was the people involved in the committees, because the City of London Corporation's Common Council of 100 people, apparently 94 of which are independents and 6 are Labour, as I saw it on a Wikipedia site, the Anne Fairweather and Bob Warnock then started to reply to the multitude of letters that was written. People such as Esther Freud was one of them, the great novelist, but a whole cross section of people. So, Robert, there is also a movement against this. I'm aware that there's a protest this week, isn't there, at the pond?
So I gather, yeah. So I believe. I think the Men's Pond Association's got a meeting going.
Yeah. Okay.
There's been petitions. There's also been rumours from various swimming groups, Heath swimmers, water rats, and other people, and I think some of the associations of direct action, swim-ins. So the issue's becoming a bit more exposed. Would you agree with that, Robert?
Oh yes. I mean, I think it's very interesting that I suspect that the city wanted the whole thing, closed and done with by the at the beginning of this year. But it hasn't closed. It keeps on bubbling up. People, are genuinely involved with this particular issue, and they very clearly want some answers. I mean, they've very simply, their position seems to be, broadly speaking, that if it's been free for more than 150 years, why is it no longer free? And that brings in all the associated questions that we brought up this evening.
Yeah.
It's opening, for the City of London, I assume, it's opening a Pandora's box.
Yeah, absolutely. I got 2 questions, Robert, and one is in continuation with what Andrew was just saying a few moments ago. But the first one is about, I presume you know about this book called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. There's a book by this Canadian author who talks about globalization and privatization of the world, etc., resources.
Yes.
Her name is Naomi Klein, and she has a book called The Shock Doctrine. And the book focuses on how businesses uses moments of great crisis to consolidate power, and particularly to buy spaces. Like, for example, one of the cases that is mentioned in the book in one of the chapters is what happens in New Orleans after the floods in New Orleans. There was a lot of disputes about big corporations and private business buying pieces of land in New Orleans, and the city was resisting that. But when the floods came, they got away with buying the places. So they used this specific moment of crisis to consolidate power. So my question to you, do you think COVID-19 is being used in any shape or form? Or the danger that to be used in certain ways, so people are distracted with certain things where, other people are doing business on these sides. Business which in certain ways, as you mentioned at some point, are kind of unethical, or at least, if not unethical, dubious in the nature it is done. That's my first question. And the second question is this: are we going to expect more in the media about this? Because this is an important issue. Important in the sense that it sets a precedent for many things that might happen in the future.
Yeah. Well, indeed, it does set a precedent, and that's something people should be worried about.
Yeah.
I mean, Hampstead Heath doesn't seem like a huge commercial opportunity. However, the legislation that the Corporation of London used in order to describe the duck ponds as a swimming facility and thereby charge for using them, wrongly in my opinion, also contains other powers which possibly might allow them to develop other activities on the heath,
Yeah, yeah,
which will be used for raising revenue.
yeah,
And I think that is something that some people are concerned about and worried about.
yeah.
We've seen that with the Royal Parks in London, where they've, you know, they're not quite the places they were. I mean, Hampstead Heath particularly is a place where you should be able to go and walk quietly and get away from the stresses and strains of life, and indeed go for a swim if you feel like it with the ducks and the coots and what else. You know, there is a danger that this would change. Much has to do with the ambitions of the City of London in this matter, how much money they think they want to raise, how much revenue people think they want to raise. My fear is that they would like to see the thing being able to wash its face by raising enough revenue to mean that, you know, there are no costs for the City of London. I think it's also worth pointing out, by the way, that when we had one of these meetings at the end of last year, the corporation's own figures about the numbers used in the pond in relation to the cost suggested that it was something in the region of, I'm here using my recollection, but it was the actual cost of a swim was something like £1.11 or something like that in the men's pond. I seem to remember calculating. So those figures are a long way from the £4 that's now being charged. You know, I think they look. These figures are not. They're very fluid and they're very unreliable. These numbers, figures, how many people swim, how many people will swim.
How much does it cost?
Those were certainly the facts on which the Corporation of London was operating at our meetings in last winter.
Yeah. There was also the seasons pass, which is, you know, is a decent and a good deal, but that hasn't been honoured since COVID-19. And I think, Juan, when you touch on Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, I've been alerted recently to another wonderful book called States of Exception by Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher. And I cannot remember where this comes from, but it's about philosophy and law. And there's a phrase in there which said, necessity needs no law. So in other words, you know, if there's a need, there shouldn't be a law. But the overriding kind of theme is that governments, corporations, sort of power structures can sometimes create a state of exception, whatever that exception is, usually a war. Some people, you know, so COVID-19 was one of them. Some people say they create, or there's a state of exception which enables them to act in ways that possibly we're talking about because it's a necessity. But in that case, necessity needs no law. There are lots of people in this community who, you know, for health, socializing and stress, mental health, etc., find swimming, walking, but swimming in the Hampstead ponds a necessity as well. And another thing, the running track there, I was once on the running track with no one there in the middle of the day, and then a few kids joined me, and they were interested in what I was doing, and I was encouraging them to do some exercises, etc. And then I was kicked off that running track because, again, I had to pay either a monthly fee or a daily fee. So,
and who kicked you out? A police officer or a guard in the park?
The City of London Corporation.
Okay.
So we're touching on interesting things here, and I was just going to say, Robert, as you're aware, some of the cheap accusations which come is that this is Hampstead Heath, and these people are a bunch of middle to upper class NIMBYs.
Well, and the people are using it.
Yes, and it's not in my backyard, and it's such a, quite frankly, a pathetic slander. If anyone who's ever been to Jamaica knows, you know, the backyard, you look after it fervently. You know, you look after your backyards, and it's not a Hampstead Heath issue. It's not a London issue. It's not a Great Britain issue.
No, it is.
It's a world issue. I come from New Zealand, where the encroaching privatization and these kind of trickery is used to do this. And I'm sure in Colombia as well, it's very
absolutely. No, absolutely.
um,
I mean,
mitigated against some of
yeah,
those
yeah.
charges.
Well, this is, it brings us right back to the Hampstead Heath Act, because the Hampstead Heath Act recognized the necessity, if to use that word, of giving ordinary people, many of them without very much in the way of economic or financial power, a place where they could go and have, for their own pleasure and diversion. And that takes us right back to that basic fundamental principle.
Yeah.
So that's
So,
the point I was going to make.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, it goes also with another thing, Robert. If you think about it, if you travel anywhere in the world, if you go to places like New York City in the United States, you find out, compare even places like Paris, Madrid, even Berlin, to less extent Berlin, how green London is. It's the largest Western capital, in the world. I mean, in the industrialized world, one of the largest, not as large as Tokyo or anything like that, or Mexico City, but it's large, and certainly the largest in Western Europe. But it's green. It's green, and the greenery of London was basically a vision of the Victorians. And this vision of the Victorians was about the well-being of people having spaces. Even it's in the name, common. Clapham Common, Stockwell Common, the word common, for the common people, for the community as a whole. And the thing is, there are so many contradictions in this story. And the first thing is we have to be alert is that we always tend to think that everything is a given. The public spaces in London, they will remain public. No, you soon realize that depends who is in government, and the encroaching of private money, it is an affront against your freedom as a citizen, the spaces that you can occupy as a citizen in your own city. So you have to be very aware of that. And in terms of the contradictions like it's a public space running by a charity which is associated with banks and one of the wealthiest parts of the world, the City of London, the actual City of London, the corporation.
Yeah. It strikes me. Sorry, go on.
No, and the other contradiction is this. If you think about it, these corporations for a while have been talking about a social charter, as sort of kind of a way of giving back to the society. This is the way that they should be giving back to the society, not charging, and because they are not short of money, financing these spaces, not only the ponds in Hampstead Heath, or the well-being or preserving places like Epping Forest, which is huge, but many other places, and offering much more, a diversity of what, a common Londoner can do without having to pay. That would be a kind of a real investment in the social sort of kind of policy of those banks. That doesn't happen. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was simply going to add to that. I think that I don't think we've ever lived in a time which was more commercial. Everything has to be monetized.
Yeah.
Everything has to be looked at from the point of view of some bottom line of profit and return. And I think that even when you looked at Victorian society, it was far more diverse and variegated than the society we now have.
Yeah.
There were all sorts of institutions and organizations in Victorian Britain which were not about making money.
Yeah.
And when I look at modern Britain, it seems I can find very few things which are not about making money. So I think we've gone too far in that direction, and we need to recalibrate, and we need to adjust society. Well, that I suppose is the danger, if that's a fact, and I think it is a fact. That's where we have gone.
Oh, it's definitely a fact. I mean, with the age of austerity, as we know, which comes from the irresponsible financial communities deregulating and being allowed to deregulate, and the debacle that happened in 2008. Then
Stiegel Act, yes.
Yes, then the austerity. I come from New Zealand, where this started in 1984 with a Labour government, and the neoliberal economic model, as we call it, which a wonderful book by a guy called Bruce Jesson, a New Zealand intellectual who ran the council, which is titled Only Their Purpose is Mad. And partly what he said was the neoliberals, who operate on both sides of the aisle now, will try and isolate everything as an individual cost. And when they can say, put it to the individual cost, then they can say, well, it's not for the collective good. So therefore, why would we have any kind of public money or council money or government money, etc. Therefore, if it's the individual user, it can be privatized. In New Zealand, they called it user pays. So this ideology, I mean, and you know, the young people in our society at the moment are just getting pillared. They've grown up in this. Part of my generation grew up in this. You know, and as I say to some deaf ears there, and I've heard you, Robert, because you have a great deal of integrity and fire in this issue, some people they just presume that you have to pay for absolutely everything. And on top of that, we've got a council tax, we've got parking permits, you know, various other permits. I mean, this is another indirect taxation coming from a corporation / charity that looks after the financial interests of some of the richest human beings in the civilization of the world. We don't even know who they are because they're not transparent enough to tell us. And we, you know, the International Tax Justice Network that looks into tax havens says that we're talking trillions. Is it 30 trillion or something that they think is hidden in tax havens? And the people that hide this money are often gun runners, prostitution rackets, narco traffickers, as well as multinational corporations who are effectively allowed to do that. And their leverage is the employees that they keep. So it is a big issue. And I think this is a epicenter of it. And doing the research today with the Hampstead Heath net protecting the heath, they went back to the 1829 and back to the 1871 Act, and they called it one of Britain's first modern environmental fights.
It was a very radical, inspiring thing to have done, and it laid the ground for lots of other things that came afterwards. The opening of the green spaces of society for country parks and those sort of things.
They talked about those early pioneers, guys, and they said they and others spent years negotiating, fundraising, and fighting to protect this space, i.e. Hampstead Heath, and other spaces. Back then, preserving heritage and protecting open space for the public was seen as an act of rebellion against the ruling and land-owning classes at a time when the right to vote was linked to land ownership and a man's right to do what he liked with his own property was seen as paramount.
Absolutely. It's quite interesting, this kind of cyclical elements, is that the story kind of started to repeat itself, or the story never goes away, rather. And when there's a new feudal system where the feudalism, or the idea of feudalism, who owns what, or I own this piece of land, is perpetrated to money, or is exercised through money, private money. So it becomes feudalized. But as you said, Robert, it's not only charging for streaming, it's the possibility that they start using that public space for something else, building whatever they want to build. If you don't stop them at some point, if you don't start to defend those places, you are opening yourself for all sort of kind of abuses, basically.
I mean, as I understand, my knowledge of economic history is such that the concept of public land is quite an old one. I suppose it goes back to Saxon times, I don't know. But there were plenty of spaces which in the 18th century started to get enclosed. And I think that probably what happened in Hampstead in the 19th century, in the 1870s, was partly a reaction against that they'd seen what had happened in the previous century with the enclosure of land. And here they were saying, this bit of old Middlesex countryside, first of all, will not be built on, it will be kept as countryside. And not only that, the citizens will have the right to use it. And that is part of the whole sort of philosophical thrust of what happened. And the City of London seemed to fail, either through ignorance or willful neglect to understand and observe that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
guys, and specifically Robert, just sort of as we come to the end here, where do we go from here? I'm aware that there's a protest this week. I think it is on the Saturday outside the Hampstead Men's Pond. I'm pretty sure it's on the Saturday. There's rumours of direct action in the future, mass swim-ins possibly. I think where else do we go? Because the associations and the public have tried things like consultation and been effectively deceived,
Bushwhacked.
bushwhacked. The
Yeah.
states of exception, which has been the COVID, has been a state of exception to get this law more vociferously imposed, one could say. And also prior to this, is there any kind of, I mean, the United Swimmers Association, I love the word united as opposed to being divided, and Good South, who's very strong on the 1871 Heath Act.
I think the fundamental thing is that not to forget that what the facts have been and are, what Hampstead Heath is. We must not forget that the ponds are an integral part of Hampstead Heath. We mustn't allow that to disappear from people's minds with the passing of time. I think we've got to go on asking a lot of questions about what are these charitable funds used for. We've got to, if we're not satisfied with the answers that we're getting, if we're getting answers which suggest that there is some incongruity in what the Corporation of London is doing, on one hand compared to another, I think we want to pursue that. It will have to be looked at. I think this is a can of worms which the Corporation of London has opened up. And I think we want to go on examining the contents of the can for quite a long time in public, debating it, and inviting interested politicians to look into it as well. Because I think that, things go on for a long time, but they don't go on forever. And the Corporation of London can't go on forever, and they can't go on operating in this sort of way. They've got to be answerable, and we've got to make them answerable.
Yeah, they have to be accountable. Also, I'm optimistic, Robert. I don't know. I'm optimistic. I think we're entering an era, worldwide almost, in which of protests, mostly pacific protests, peaceful protests, but basically challenging laws and legislations that occur all over the place about these kind of things.
Yes, we live in an era of authoritarian politicians.
Authoritarian, exactly. Politicians and political, and ossified political structures in many countries. They think that they can get away with it, and they have to be challenged constantly all the time. I think another element that has to be there is about making people more aware. The media has to become aware, and social media, and start moving things in Twitter and stuff like that. That will create that response. In the same way that the government has to do on YouTube with A-level exams and GCSE exams, they might have to do a YouTube with this one.
I think what's happening here this evening with this particular debate, I think is probably the best sort of expression of what social media can do on these sort of occasions.
Indeed.
I mean, it can behave in an appalling way, we all know. But I think here's an example of where somebody is opening up a debate in relation to what they to governments, to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and to ask questions, find out.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And in a more profound way, it goes about liberal ideas of pluralism, individuality, and equality. It goes with that parable by Bertolt Brecht. He said, no, first they took the Jews, but because I wasn't a Jew, I didn't care. Then they took the communists, and because I wasn't a communist either, but I didn't pay attention. Then they took the gays, etc., until they took me, and it was too late. That kind of idea that you have to care about what is happening to other people, even if it supposedly doesn't affect you directly, in the first instance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
he's hoping that this time the people of the world, London, the Heath, and the Swimmers are all in it together, as opposed to one of the ex-chancellors who had a trust fund and a tax haven and said exactly the same quote as he tore the social fabric out of society. Mr. George Osborne, who's is also the editor, or was the editor of the Evening
Evening
Standard.
Standard, yeah.
The Evening Standard's just been put
And the man responsible for the austerity plan.
well, he's just been put in the House of Lords, the owner of the Evening Standard. But if he's a Russian, then he'll be familiar with the benefits and the fraternity and the health benefits and the camaraderie and the beauty of cold water swimming. So maybe he will write more favourable articles too.
Yeah.
All right. So just to wrap it up, on behalf of the programme and Artefacto, Robert Sutherland Smith from United Swimmers Association of Hampstead, thank you very much for coming on. This will be put on YouTube. We are on ZTR Radio.
ZTR Radio, we will put a podcast about this.
There's Revista Perro Negro
Negro.
magazine. But you know, as just before I push, you know, the pause, any final last words from you, Robert? Many thanks again.
Okay, well, to use a word which is going out of fashion, thank you for inviting me. Everybody says thank you for having me, which sounds rather dubious, but no, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
for doing what you're doing, and may this kick on from here. So
Yeah,
thank you very much, guys.
absolutely.